It is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to the ACDH lecture 6.1. The number signifying the year. We are in the 6th year of the center now, and this is the first lecture of 2020, which is mainly due to the extraordinary circumstances we all have been dealing with over the past couple of months. Welcome on behalf of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage and the Ericsson Education Working Group of the ACDH. Welcome also on behalf of our panelists, Tanja Wissig, Vanessa Hannesschläger, Britta Breyers, and Katharina Strnadl. Many thanks to all of them and to Maria Wiederänders for making this event possible. Well, before we get down to brass tacks, I should like to say a few words about this event and to make a few general remarks in order to put everything in a somewhat larger context. This lecture was organized by the Austrian Center of Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage. The center was set up with a declared goal of fostering digital methods in the various fields of the humanities and offers a wide range of services. It is running a digital archive that goes by the name ARCE, a resource center for the humanities. It hosts and publishes digital data, develops software, and works on the dissemination of the digital paradigms, offering advice and guidance to the research community through its help desk and a set of workshops, lectures, tool galleries, summer schools, and an internship program in support of young researchers and other such activities. Apart from providing infrastructure services, the ACDH also pursues research in various fields of the digital humanities, which have been largely focused on text and language-oriented disciplines in the humanities. Current projects investigate innovative technical infrastructure components, digital standards, digital language resources, and semantic technologies. All of these activities have been embedded in the European Infrastructure Consortia Clarion and DARIAH, in which many colleagues of the center have been actively participating over the past couple of years. What all of this is about is digital humanities, which we regard as part of a profound social transformation. Digital humanities imply new methods, new questions, and hopefully new answers. Digital humanities have got to do with technology, but not only with technology. Our much wider understanding of technology-enhanced research in social sciences, cultural studies, and humanities has got to do with innovation and has a strong social component. For us, digital humanities means combining digital and social infrastructures, transdisciplinary approaches, means collaborative methods and participative technologies, and last but not least, the whole range of open approaches such as open data, open access, and open source. Which takes me right to today's presentation, which will deal with the TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, and its guidelines. Taking a quick look at the long list of currently conducted projects on the homepage of our center, 40 plus as of today, you will hardly see anything that has not in some way or another got to do with the TEI. The TEI definitely being the most widely used community standard in the humanities. And one of the founding fathers and most active protagonists in the TEI community is our guest today, Laurent Romary. Laurent is a very dear, very special guest, not less because of the close ties he has had with the ACDH-CH from the very beginning of its foundation, supporting us in a great many ways, some of us having been working with him on various projects already long before that time. Laurent is a corpus linguist by profession who has been working on a wide range of digital research infrastructure components for a long time. Apart from his TEI activities, many of you may have got to know Laurent as director of the European Research Infrastructure DARIAH, the digital research infrastructure for the arts and humanities. Currently, he serves as directeur de recherche at INRIA, the Institut National de Recherche en Informatique et en Automatique in Paris. He has been conducting research on the modeling of semi-structured documents with a specific emphasis on texts, lexica, and linguistic resources. Next to his continued engagement in many different capacities with the TEI, Laurent has also been very active for many years in standardization activities relating to digital language resources within ISO Committee TC37. I will break here with the tradition of highlighting particular publications. Most of what Laurent has ever published in written form can be found on HAL, the French Open Archives of Research Publications, which is also an indicator of the importance of the concept of openness in his career as a researcher. We're looking forward with great interest and curiosity to today's lecture, which is the title TEI Guidelines Born to be Open. Laurent, the screen is all yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and the very nice introduction. I guess you can all see my slide. The second part of the title is intended to make you relax while I speak, because you will think of the corresponding song. And now that you've got the tune in mind, you will not get rid of it until the end. That's Born to be Open, for those who did not recognize that. As a matter of fact, my talk is not entirely about the TEI. It's only half about the TEI, the second half. But I wanted to make the link between the TEI world and the notion of open science as it is now basically in our everyday life as researchers, scholars, whatever you call it. So we're in this situation where we need to understand what is expected from us in the domain of open science, or whether we just want to be open by definition. The interesting things right from the beginning, when I started to hear about open science, for instance, at EU level, I thought, well, this is what we've always been doing in our digital scholarship community. And that's interesting to see where this feeling may be coming from, the feeling that we've been forerunners in the domain of open science. So I try to couple my two domains of interest, open science and the TEI guidelines, to try to explain why I've got this feeling. By doing that, I'll try to provide a coherent picture of the various forms that open science may take. Of course, publications, data seen as sources in our community. And I'll take these three personal sources of inspiration from my experience. I mean, the 27 number is really frightening at the end of the slide. I made my first email to Jean Véronis in 1993, asking him about the TEI because I needed that for a project. So that's quite some time ago. The interesting thing is that basically my activism in the domain of open access and the things I've tried to be doing in DARIAH and the TEI, for me, this is one single endeavor during this period. You will see, because I'm quite involved in the French arena, I would say that you may see some French things here and there, but do not be frightened. I'll try to translate this one. So opening science. The first question to ask is probably why we want to see science more open. Obviously, it has to do with the communication of scholarly results, scientific results. For obvious scholarly reasons, we want to confront, we want to validate our assumptions, we want to be able to reproduce observations on our data, for instance. But the recent period has shown that we need also to show what we are doing to the wide public at large. And being open, not just open from the point of view of publications, but also of the research process, of the assessment process in our communities, is something very important to be understood, and to make sure that the society at large is saying, let us say, right things about the things we know, which is not always obvious. The important thing, once you start thinking of it, is that you should not pinpoint at specific aspects of open science, but really have a systemic vision of it. That is, think of what could be, should be open in your everyday practice. And it can be basically anything. And so as much as possible, and probably as early as possible in the research process. So having project proposals, accepted project proposals, let's say, can be very useful, so that you know when people start a project what they are intending to do. Any kind of intermediate draft data can be useful. The description of the research process, and this is where we see the start of a link with what we're doing in the TEI, that is the description of the models you use to represent the data, the standards you've been using. This is very important. It has to do with meta science. So open meta science is also important. And finally, of course, the obvious, the final results, the analysis, and of course, the publications have to be open, accessible in a way or another. Still, when you think about it, when you start discussing with chemists and what have you, biologists or philologists, you see that they may have different notions of open science. There are technical constraints, the complexity of the data sometimes, but I think we do have complex data. The institutional constraints, because there are some practices which have somehow fossilized in some communities, and also legal differences. Some of us are working on contemporary data where there are some copyright issues. Those working with other types of information do not have these problems. So this is really complex. For me, the general message is not to see the complexity, the variety of things, it's just to understand the underlying vision. And I do like this, this picture that John Tennant put together a while ago concerning open science, which is just science done right. If you think you're doing your work correctly as a scientist, you've got an idea of how open science could be implemented for you or for your community. Why do we speak so much of open science in a context where it should just be science done right? It's probably because openness is not the default in many respects. If we just think of publications, you've all encountered the fact that you need to pay for accessing a lot of publications through paywalls by journals, for instance, through subscription. Or if you don't, you see that you've got to pay quite a large amount of money to have a publication paid in open access. Publication in the Lancet can be up to 7,500 euros and beyond. If you look at the Frontiers journal portfolio, you see that you've got figures between 2,000, 3,000 for one single paper to be published. So there's a really difficult situation here with the publication market. And when we speak about open science, we need to make sure, for instance, that the same situation will not occur for other types of results that we want to make open, like data. There are some very psychological reasons that science is not always open. I'll open later, or I need to finish my PhD first, and then you discover that once you've done your PhD, you've got no time. And I've seen colleagues knocking at my door 2 years before they retire and say, oh, I've got all these data, I should put them somewhere. And this is something we need to evangelize about. And of course, there are some technical reasons in some communities, but even in our communities, people do not necessarily know about the appropriate standards, have access to the appropriate repositories, or do not have the corresponding tools to play with the data. And even at a very personal level, the lack of a proper open science culture may prevent people from documenting the process through which they've been going to create some data, to adopt an appropriate licensing framework, or even cite data. We are all used in citing publications, but not necessarily the underlying data sets. And of course, like I said, not everything can be open. There are copyright constraints. There are restrictions related to personal information, sensitive data, and so on that may make things a little bit complex. To have an idea of the global complexity, you can also refer to this diagram by UNESCO on a recent document about open science, where you see the variety of domains where open science at large could be applied. And you see things about assessment, open evaluation, open labs, describing, for instance, through electronic laboratory notebooks, the process in chemistry, biology. You got things about open innovation when you want to make sure that you open things once you've got an idea on how they will be transferred to industry, for instance. There are a lot of aspects which makes the picture a little bit complex. So how can science be more open? My message has always been that we need to think of it both at the individual and at the collective level. Individually, we need to adopt each of us, I would say, a strategy for disseminating the various components of our research projects as much as we can. So it has to be part of our research methods themselves. At a more institutional point of view, we need to make sure that open science is a component of the strategy of higher education and research institutions. Some of us, I guess, attending this seminar are involved in some decision processes for our institutions or have some roles in the community, and we need to say, look, when we speak about reporting, about assessment, about communication for our institution, how do we introduce the open science component in there? Still, it's not just a matter of acting, it's really to ask ourselves the good questions. One of the essential, I mean, the big keywords probably for today is this notion of digital sovereignty. At each stage of what we're doing, can we make sure that we identify who is responsible for the content, who owns the content legally, who is responsible for the curation, and also who hosts the content. So when you publish a paper in a journal by Elsevier, for instance, of course, your paper is somewhere online and accessible, whether you pay a fee or not, but it is on a server on which you've got no power. That is, if Springer Elsevier is closing shops in the coming weeks, you never know, things may happen, the information may be lost. So you need to have a strategy that openness may be related, and this is the kind of answer to the question about digital sovereignty, to the existence of public sustainable infrastructures on which we can have a say. Finally, a word concerning the political agenda. You've identified that it has started already. You've seen from the EU programs and future programs that there's been step by step more and more open access, then open science pressures, I would say, with now the obligation to produce, for instance, data management plans for each EU projects, but that's the case also for a lot of national funding agencies. So for instance, the French one, ANR, has such an obligation now. And since Charlie mentioned HAL, ANR has a mandate that all the publications resulting from their funding be available on the French National Publication Repository in open access. I wanted to, when you've got some spare time and you get the slides afterwards, to follow this link. HCERES is the very nice and pronounceable acronym of the French Assessment Agency for all higher education and research institutions. And they've actually decided to pull all the so-called auto-assessment reports online, freely accessible on HAL as a specific portal. So this is nice to see step by step, week after week, that things are moving in the good direction. Some words about the legal context, whether we are allowed to be open in a way or another. I would say it's not that we are allowed, we are obliged. To make a long story short, by default, in the European and even more in the French legislation, as far as I can tell for my own country, research data must be open by default as part of this very nice implementation of the so-called PSI directive at European level, so the Public Sector Information Directive. And it's even more than that. The responsibility falls on the institution to do so, and the researcher is clearly identified as the operator. And there are even some specific cases for which information has been mandatory for many years, like geographic information or environmental data. Of course, all these legal domains have expressed some exceptions. I mentioned some of them, like intellectual property and the like. The important thing is that for many years, there's always been exceptions for our bread and butter, I should say. That is cultural organizations like libraries, museums, archives, which have the possibility to have some specific constraints on the dissemination of information. So it's not illegal for some museums, for instance, to sell pictures of their contents and not to allow people to reuse the pictures naturally, which is a shame in certain situations. But I'll come back to that when I speak about the data reuse charter to see how we can not circumvent, but negotiate a better setting. Okay, open science in practice. Let me start with publications because it's basically useless to start having big plans concerning open science if we don't have a real strategy at the lower level for publication. We do need, all of us, to make sure that we fight, we work for more open access to scholarly publications and have a clear strategy concerning this. So the difficulties are clear. I mentioned that of access and the paywalls, the cost through APCs, with the ultimate shame of so-called hybrid journals, where on the one hand, you've got institutions paying for the subscriptions, but then the publisher nicely opens the door to making the publication accessible at the date of publication if you pay an extra fee, which can be as expensive as a fee in a natively open access journal. And of course, even if you do so, even if like I said, the paper is available on the Springer server, you're not finished because you don't have access to the real content. For instance, if you want to do data mining over a corpus of publications. So there is a real issue of sovereignty with the possibility to create, or the impossibility to create, a portfolio, a corpus, one would say in our community, of such productions. By doing that, we take away some possibilities to actually mine the data, identify new or older discoveries, and do the real work we should be doing with the publications. As an example of a way to fight against that, I like to mention the policy of my own institutions. I've been a little bit responsible in this, so I like it twice. We've got a so-called deposit mandate. That is, only the papers deposited in HAL will appear in the annual reports for the various research teams. So if you want your paper if you want to boast your papers in your annual report, you've got to put it on HAL first. We decided to have a centralized budget for so-called APCs, so the article processing charges, what you would pay to publish in open access journals, so that we control what's going on and we can speak with the researchers about the opportunity to pay such fees. And in particular, we've got a general ban on hybrid journal. So when researchers want to have their paper open in hybrid journals, we say, put them on HAL, we won't pay for that, basically. And we've started to unsubscribe to non-essential journals or collections to be able to reinvest in open platforms. So we dropped Nature 2 years ago. We thought it was just a matter of coquetry to have a subscription to Nature. And when we identified that the LNCS, sorry for those who like the LNCS series, but the LNCS series by Springer, which is mainly junk, we decided to stop also the corresponding lecture notes in computer science, LNCS, for those who ask, to drop the subscription. And you'll say, oh, he's speaking about how the French context, but he's not speaking about the essential things. Academia, ResearchGate, we've got such nice platforms. If you don't want me to say naughty words today, don't ask me more about this, but read the two blog posts that you see. The first one, mainly written by Hergé Bateau-Chifra, the open science officer from DARIAH, and the second one by Naomi Truhan, a linguist researcher who has explained why she dropped her subscription to Academia and ResearchGate a while ago. So mainly the gist of those posts is, well, these are not public, reliable, sustainable infrastructures where you would want to put your data. Data. Once you're set with publications, and I get you got the message there, we can think of data management. The obvious entry point is the notion of data management plans. You've all heard that. It has become, like I said, a mandatory deliverable in many funding agencies. So for instance, if you take the constraints from the ERC, you see the various domains where you need to describe what you're going to do or what you have as data in your project. So you're describing the data set, the associated metadata, how much the data will be open and closed depending on the constraints you have, and so on and so forth. So it's quite nice because this is something you've got to do at the beginning of your project, the beginning of the chain, but it's a little bit simple. It takes data as an abstract object and not necessarily something anchored on a research process. And what I would like to do with you is to show something that I've developed in the context of a French network of scholars in the domain of heritage science, who expressed the difficulty they had, for instance, with the DMPs as administrative documents. As soon as you require someone to do something, they see that as an administrative constraints, and transform this energy into something that could be put at the service of science proper. So what we identified is a kind of general organization of the research process, so data seen from the data generation process in heritage science, where you've got the obligation to design a research project because you need to access some kind of equipment at some point in your research. You need to identify the objects on which you want to work. For instance, objects taken from a museum, from an archive. You carry out experiments, generating a lot of primary data, rough data, on which you apply some mathematical or graphical transformations to generate your final secondary data sets, and then you go to the publication. And when we discussed around this schema, which is quite generic and applicable in a lot of domains in heritage science, so I remember the case of this PhD student working on the analysis of ink in medieval manuscripts, so bombarding with spectrographic methods all the poor medieval manuscripts and try to identify the composition of the inks at the time. It was going exactly along those steps. And now thinking of it from the point of view of open science, we say, okay, we've got a preparatory phase where we identify what would be done in the project, the actual experimentation phase where you gather your samples, you do the experiments, the analysis, and prepare the publication, and then what happens after the project, so the dissemination phase, when your PhD is finished, when your funding is over, and so on and so forth. I don't want to take too much time on this, but basically we said, well, there are many documents or activities that could be put together at the service of open science in such an environment. So during the preparatory phase, you need to make sure that you somehow publish your project proposal, that you prepare your data management plan, as we've seen, that you anticipate on the reuse conditions, because in such a project, you see that not only the researcher, but also the cultural heritage institution from which the sample has been taken, the facility with which you carry out your experiment may have a say on the reuse rights, the reuse conditions associated to the data. During the experimentation phase, we identified that we would need to deploy more and more real digital laboratory notebooks to really trace the various steps through which the data would go. And of course, at the dissemination phase, to anticipate as early as possible on where the results would be archived and published with all kinds of openness constraints which have been identified beforehand. So one of the things we experimented with them is this object, the data reuse charter, which we started to think of, 4 or 5 years ago, across several institutions, DARIAH, Clarin, ERIS, Archival Portal Europe and Europeana, and where we identified 6 principles along which the various stakeholders in a research process, so the researcher, the cultural heritage institution, the facility for technical experiments, but also the data hosting institution would have to situate from the point of view of data reuse. I'm not going to explain these 6 principles in detail. I'll show a precise example afterwards, but the method that we anticipated was a self-declaration from each party. So they discuss together for a research project, or in general, if an institution has a general policy of reuse, and then post the corresponding charter across these 6 categories, principles that you see there. And the example I would like to take as an application of the data reuse charter is the DARIAH Campus environment, which has been set up by DARIAH just a couple of months ago, and which has actually designed a full implementation of the charter. So if you go on the DARIAH Campus environment, you will see by following the link, which you cannot click here on Zoom, you will see this, this declaration, this charter, which corresponds from the point of view of DARIAH to the idea that through this single portal, they wanted to create a single open science view on any kind of training resource they would gather there. Videos, text, training components from previous projects, previous partners, and so on. And through this global declaration, they provided a way for any user to know how they can enter in a kind of dialogue with the content. So that charter is based on some initial declaration about open access at large, a kind of mutual declaration of goodwill between those providing the information and those using it. And then they applied the 6 principles to make personal declarations, from which I've taken a few excerpts to tell you how they would see that. For me, the notion of reciprocity is essential in any kind of projects where we've got several stakeholders, several actors, like we have here for DARIAH Campus. And reciprocity is expressed here by the idea that anyone using the content from DARIAH Campus is encouraged to provide feedback, but also to contribute new training materials if necessary. Interoperability is obvious somehow concerning the choice of using open format, standardized format, have even the content described openly through the GitHub repository. Citability with a clear citation model. Openness in general by applying a systematic CC BY license to all contents. Stewardship, which is very important when you've got several stakeholders to identify who is taking the responsibility for the maintenance and the long-term availability of the content, in that case, DARIAH as such. And trustworthiness, we'll come back to that, I guess, soon, in relation to the traceability of the data. When you've got some content on the repository like DARIAH Campus, how can you know where this from where this content is coming, who are the initial contributors, the initial designers of the training content. So before we go any further, for this first part on open science, I'm perfectly on time. The message is, well, open science is science done right. So we need to see how we work together on sharing a culture of sharing. And we've already seen that there are various tools to do so. I've mentioned the reuse charters, DMPs, and as we go along, we may want to do more about laboratory notebooks. I'll speak about this SSK thing afterwards, and we've seen the possible role of publication repositories. But somewhere again, like I said in the introduction, it seems that for those of us from the TEI landscape, these seem to be quite obvious, and I would like to make this mental exercise of understanding why it is such. So the TEI is as an open science project. I've got my one slide called the Text Encoding Initiative for the Dummies. I'm sure most of the attendants has some background on this, but it's important just to give the basics there. So first, the TEI is, let's say, a format to simplify at this stage. It's an XML application. XML is a recommendation from the World Wide Web Consortium for representing data in forms of parenthesized block of information. So you see an example, and which is quite readable, I think. The TEI was conceived, I would say, for humanists and by humanists right from the onset, but basically it has taken up in other communities. So it's not just the humanities now, and it's not just scholars. You've got professionals or professional activities using the TEI, and it covers a lot of, I call that cool things, prose, poetry, dictionaries, of course, and a few other things. The TEI is a thick object in the sense that it has a vocabulary of nearly 600 elements with all the necessary documentation, schemas, tools that you need to work with such a representation. It's not just a technical organization, it's a human organization as a consortium of individual and institutional members. And if you want to see how much it is a human organization, go on the TEI list and ask any kind of question. You'll see that any time in the day or in the night, you'll get an answer. And it has a thing, I'll come back to this at some point, called ODD, one document decital, which sounds like a mysterious thing, but which is really, really cool to know. So first, speaking of open science, yes, the TEI guidelines, this is an open standard, which is quite obvious. So first, the question, is that a standard? If you consider, I mean, not just my definition of a standard, but quite a shared definition of a standard. There are three pillars to identify if you've got a standard. It's the result of consensus building within a community. It's publicly available, even if you've got to pay a fee, like for instance, an ISO. And it's under systematic review. That is, it's not just a document you put online once and you let it there forever. It has to be revised as the technology, for instance, evolves. This is exactly what the TEI is doing on the three aspects. So to my view, the TEI consortium is a so-called standard development organization, even if it does more for the community, but I would say this is the core of its activity. It's obviously an open standard in the sense that everything is freely available online, schemas, documentation, I mean, any kind of TEI stuff, like meeting minutes, what have you. Sometimes you've got some old notes. Everything is there since the beginning of the life of the TEI in 1987. The other thing which is interesting is that it's not open only from the point of view of the content, but also of the process itself. So the TEI is completely developed online through the GitHub environment where the community can just make some requests for changes, corrections, additions, what have you, on the so-called TEI guidelines. And you've got a lot of the discussions occurring within the specific group of experts working on the guidelines, the TEI Technical Council. A lot of their discussions are available online because they just react to the community's tickets on GitHub. And finally, which is not that obvious, the TEI is trying to rely on the public infrastructure. When you think, of course, of GitHub, you know that Microsoft is behind, so there is some danger. But for instance, the TEI has switched all its content in the recent 2 years within Humanom, which is the French national infrastructure for the humanities and part of the DARIAH infrastructure. So this is quite a safe environment from this point of view. So that's for the guideline. What I'm trying to argue is that the TEI model itself is really a paragon for the, I would say, for well-managed research data, as an example to what you should be doing for a proper data management strategy. The first thing is that by definition, this is a very important concept in the TEI, is that a document in the TEI environment always comes with its header. As a matter of fact, this is the only part which is mandatory when you start opening a TEI document. And it has to do with the notion of open metadata. That is, the TEI offers a real reference framework for documenting anything which is going on with your digital content, identifying the sources, the various contributions to the document, the various versions through which your document has gone, and finally the conditions of publication. So this is what I tried to summarize in there. Basically, with the TEI header, you can really document where your document is coming from, like the physical or the digital sources you've been using, the various contributors to the document, so what has impacted on the document, the what, the who, and the how, and the steps, so you can describe the revisions that your document has, I'm looking for the verb in English, endured, and the final publication constraints, like the citation format, the license you want to associate to your document. I would like just to provide a quick focus on one thing, which is interesting for me, is the contributors to a document. I mentioned that very quickly a little bit earlier, but when you consider any kind of research project where, as a researcher, you think you have done the essential part of the work, you always had librarians helping you to find some contents in the library, some students who have helped you to annotate the content, some technical persons who have helped you to put together the server for your data, what have you. And all these persons have to be identified in the project. So this is something interesting that the TEI really a long time ago has started to provide the necessary means as XML elements for describing those various contributors. So you've got specific elements like author, editor, funder, principal, sponsor, but also a generic element, REST statement, to actually express in a fine-grained manner the various responsibilities here. This is important because then afterwards, each of the participants in the creation of a TEI document can be cited. You can say, well, this one has specifically checked all the, let's say, punctuation in the transcription of this specific document, for instance. And this is an important trend, which you see also in the publishing sector. So I wanted to mention this credit initiative, which nicely, for publications, of course, not for data, qualifies a series of roles associated to the production of a scholarly paper, as you can see there. Back in there, so open metadata, open semantics is obvious in the TEI community because the TEI is about semantic encoding. What you tag is what you mean. when you identify something in your text you want to mark up, like the person name, you've got a tag to say, well, this is a person name and not just something which is in bold, italic, what have you. And this is part of the design of the TEI vocabulary since the beginning, that its intention was to make content as transparent as possible in designing the guidelines. The next stage on which we are currently working is to go beyond this by going towards, I would call that open commentaries in a metaphorical way, to allow a document to be also associated with the various annotations. You may have multiple annotators, mans, women, or machines working on the content. And we are working currently on the development, the council, of this new standoff element to actually provide extra stuff on a given document. And finally, of course, and this is really essential, I mentioned this magic thing, ODD, which is the specification language of the TEI that allows you to actually document the choices and the practices. So the process itself can be made open through the ODD specification language. So let me speak quickly about ODD because, shall I say, it's the most important thing in the TEI. No, of course, a lot of things are important, but as soon as you get to know ODD and master it, you're quite high on your point de vue, we say in computer games. I don't know how to say that in English. Sorry about this. So ODD. ODD is an instance of what is called literate programming, a concept introduced by Donald Knott a long time ago, and for instance implemented in the LaTeX environment. That is, the idea behind that is that you've got one single document which allows you, on the one hand, to provide a formal definition, the syntax of what is allowed in your document, and on the other hand, to produce a prose documentation which is readable by the users. And ODD itself, the specification language, is itself a TEI vocabulary. As a matter of fact, when you write an ODD document, you use mostly the normal TEI elements and then a few technical elements to provide the formal definitions. So it's really a matter of creating open models. When you've got an ODD document, if you can read it, or if you generate an output documentation, you've got a mirror of the actual way the designer of the project has conceived its own TEI subset when doing that. Of course, the TEI guidelines of this are expressed in ODD, so you can, I mean, in one click, you can download the full TEI specification, all the details of the specification, which makes really everything completely open from a TEI point of view. And the funny thing, when you go one step further, is that you can derive customization from other kinds of customization, so-called chaining data model. So for instance, if you've got a complex project, you can have a generic customization of the TEI for your project at large, and for sub parts of your projects, like during the editing phase, you can constrain things heavily, or during the publication. But if you want to design a data model, you can have a very flexible one at the beginning and step by step reduce it, for instance. There are many things that you can do so. And of course, you can even describe non-TEI vocabularies. I mentioned this work we've done on specifying this archival standard, EAD, encoding archival description by using the ODD language. A second aspect, probably third or fourth now, where the TEI can be part of the open science environment is that, of course, the TEI can be used for publications themselves. It's not a completely fancy idea. The interesting thing is that when you actually try to think of publications as something you could encode in TEI, you immediately see the continuum that could exist between primary sources that you've encoded in TEI and your publications themselves. For instance, if you want to mine or provide links between the two types of documents. Of course, the TEI is well adapted to the notion of publication documents because of the metadata. I've already shown that. The structure, which allows you to reflect on the various parts. And I would say also the very nice way of dealing with bibliographies there. There are a lot of projects using the TEI for publications, not the least publication platforms. And of course, the journal of the TEI itself is hosted by Open Edition Journal, which uses the TEI as back office. I'm not elaborating on JATS. If you've got a question, I can answer and say naughty things, but it's not the topic today. So the consequence for TEI-based project, basically for each of us, I would say, if we want to be in line with the TEI technical and cultural background, like I shown, this is quite obvious. I mean, if we've got a TEI-based project, we need to show the source. We need to show how we've actually encoded the content, and not just show a very nice looking HTML web page. We need to show our ROD, we need to show the specification, that is the underlying model choices that we made at the beginning of the project or during the project. Of course, we need to show the software. I've not spoken about open source software, but that's part of the game. And if we want to go further, we would be even, I would say, obliged somehow to show the various stages of the development of a project. The first digitization phase of a project are interesting to see, for instance, with all OCR errors, for instance, down to the final clean version that we would want to disseminate. And of course, consider some public hosting behind the scene. If we want to provide access to a lot of different documents in complex projects, it can be useful, like the DARIAH Campus initiative has done, to also associate the site with the reuse charter to say, well, you guys, I mean, if you use, for instance, some of our documents, you see errors, or you go further in the encoding than I've done, please give the result back so that I can improve the context and things like this. I put together these slides with a few keywords where there are some obvious ways of implementing the data reuse charter in a TEI context here. But I guess I've already said most of them. That will be part as an exercise of whatever you would do with the slides afterwards to develop things. As an example of a fully open project, I wanted to mention this initiative, TEI-0, which is an offspring of the TEI. The idea was a few years ago to make the TEI univocal when we want to represent legacy dictionaries. And what we've been doing is actually derive a customization of the TEI that would, for each dictionary feature that we've identified, provide one and single possible representation with the TEI vocabularies. And what we've been doing step by step, not at the early stage, I mean, we started with a no-full Google Doc and those kind of things. We decided to work on TEI-0 exactly like the TEI is doing with its own guidelines. That is, everything open on GitHub, allowing the community to react and put all the results online, even the corresponding samples and software that was developed in the context of the project. So, for instance, there is a mapping from this TEI-0 customization to the linked open data OntoLex format that is available on GitHub for you to use if you want to. Just a word of once we're here, the experience we had with TEI Lex is interesting to analyze, not from a technical point of view, but from a distance. It's not that easy to decide that you're open in this respect, because first, the dictionary world goes beyond the world of digital scholars, I would say. And I'm just saying, no one knows the TEI. I mean, you keep bumping into people who are working with dictionaries, for instance, and don't know the TEI. So it's important to link with other standardization activities. I've mentioned the W3C. You've seen a quick reference to the ISO LMF standard. This is something essential to have your proposals adopted more widely. And of course, when you speak about dictionaries, a lot of the stuff is under copyright. Like I put there, the future is bright except for the content. So it's very nice sometimes to have open formats, but when the content is not open, you need to be patient to actually disseminate all the things you're doing sometimes. And of course, there are some difficulties with a lot of legacy data which are not in the proper format and you need to transform. So even if you think it's right to use the TEI, I mean, you need to deal not only with alternatives in the current world, but also with legacy information. Last topic before I conclude, it's just a nice little thing we've been doing in an EU project called Parthenos, where we developed this funny thing, the standardization survival kit. Initially, that was an environment where we wanted to show how standards could be used in the context of a research project. And it has developed into a real research process description environment. So we wanted to describe research scenarios where you had several steps, one after the other, in any kind of domain. I'm going to show an example. And at each step, we would point to bibliographic references, online resources like tutorials, wiki pages, reference documents, and the like. And so when we arrived at the design stage of this SSK, we said, okay, we've got this problem that we want to provide information about open processes, and we would like this information to be as transparently available and open as the processes themselves. This is where we decided to use the TEI itself as a language for describing those scenarios and those steps. For those who are TEI aficionados, we've been using the event element. I'm going to show this. So it should work if I switch. Yeah. So as an example, this is one of the scenarios we have. I guess you all see that on the SSK, which has been designed by Charlie and two other colleagues from INRIA, Charles and Lionel. And it shows how to create a dictionary in TEI with various stages here. Build the model of the dictionary, so design your OD in particular, create a corpus of useful resources to inform the dictionary buildings, setting up the editing environment, and so on and so forth. So at each stage, you can have the corresponding resources. I had said to myself I would never click to something, but too late. Okay, see, it's just the pop-up. So you should be seeing this, the various sources which have been attached to that. But the interesting things is not there because we're not here to speak about the SSK, but the fact that for each scenario here, and for each stage, you've got the possibility to go back to the source to see what's going on GitHub for those various scenarios and steps. So I've pre-called the links. I didn't want to make stupid things there. So if you go to, you click on the scenario, you'll see that you've got a real TEI document with proper attribution to the authors. As a matter of fact, of course, the citation is generated automatically from this, and the actual content of a scenario, which is basically a list of events pointing to the various steps with some additional information description there. If you go on one of the steps, you will see that it's also a very nice TEI document with some descriptions associated to the steps and the various references to the resources that have been found useful for this step. The idea there is to have such an open process that anyone could go and create new scenarios, create new steps, or even make some corrections, so interact with the content by means of its online availability. So that was the right. So the lessons learned with this SSK environment, it's the penultimate slide and my voice is disappearing step by step, which is a good thing that it's the penultimate slide. It was a kind of magic, even if I think it was obvious for me right from the beginning that it would do the game, but the TEI has been really an essential tool, both for the design of the underlying model, but also to play the open game completely. And this is a kind of lesson that when you think of new projects, even where you wouldn't have some primary sources to encode and where the TEI would not be the obvious choice, that you can do extra thing with the TEI. I mean, what I call performative descriptions, that you can describe processes, you can describe objects for which, for instance, you would do some simulation afterwards. So by being seminal in the development of this project and what we've been doing in the SSK, the TEI has also proven to be very robust from a technical point of view, I must say. And we played a little bit with the, I don't know whether there is a member of the TEI Technical Council in the group because I cannot see the participants at present, but we played with the council a little bit by making some suggestions of evolutions related to such use case of the TEI which had probably not been anticipated. Okay, conclusions. The motto that you could leave the room with is probably that the TEI is fair by construction. And there is a real culture of open data management. And most of the research projects I know who apply the TEI sometimes are actually deploying proper data management strategies without mentioning it, without putting together a data management plan, without even knowing that there is this awful acronym FAIR, the FAIR principles, and that you would have to transform your data into something which would be fair. When you're within the TEI environment, your data is fair by constructions. This is related, like I said, to the specific relation to the document that the TEI has, the importance of the source, data modeling, dissemination, but also the importance of the relation between the text and the scholar doing some interpretation, encoding word. If Lou would be in the room, I think he would speak about interesting theories of the text related to the use of the TEI. So I would say we're not finished. The TEI is not dead, I would say, and far from it, because we're still ahead of a lot of the principles which are now emerging in the domain of open science, and we need to keep advocating for such value as part of our everyday work as digital scholars. So, merci beaucoup pour votre attention.